At 9:42 a.m. on June 13, 2025, two RAF Typhoon fighters roared from Lossiemouth, Scotland to intercept a Russian IL-20 that had slipped 2 kilometers into Polish airspace. Flying dark, ignoring hails, the aircraft's incursion was reckless and provocative amid already high tensions. Within minutes, the British jets intercepted it. No shots were fired. The IL-20 banked east and left NATO skies. But what if it hadn't ended quietly? What if the order had been to fire? The downing of a Russian spy plane in 2025 would send shockwaves far beyond Poland, reshaping military, political, and economic fault lines across the global security landscape, NATO's rules of engagement. Contrary to the dramatizations of popular films, NATO pilots do not fire at intruders on instinct. Their actions are strictly governed by the alliance's rules of engagement, a carefully constructed playbook designed to prevent unnecessary conflict. The process begins with detection. NATO's vast network of radar, satellites, and ground-based sensors constantly monitors European airspace. The moment an unauthorized aircraft crosses into NATO territory, alerts are triggered. The next step is identification. Interceptors are scrambled to visually confirm the aircraft's type, origin, and possible intent. Pilots approach closely enough to observe markings, loadouts, and behavior. Once identification is made, NATO aircrews attempt to establish radio contact. Standard hails are issued repeatedly, often in multiple languages and across distress frequencies. Warnings along the lines of, "You are entering restricted airspace. Turn around immediately." If the intruder continues to ignore communications, the situation escalates to escort. Fighters fly alongside the intruder at close range, tipping their wings and signaling physically that the aircraft must leave. Even at this stage, weapons remain cold. Only in the final stage, action is the use of force authorized. And even then, there is a critical condition. The intruder must pose an imminent threat to lives on the ground or to critical installations. That means heading directly toward a major city, a nuclear plant, or a military facility while ignoring every warning. This layered approach is essential because reconnaissance planes such as the IL-20 are typically unarmed. They are designed to gather intelligence with advanced sensors and antennas, not to engage in combat. Shooting one down may technically be defensible under international law, but politically and diplomatically it is explosive. It is akin to killing an unarmed journalist who trespassed. It may be legal, but it would provoke outrage far beyond the initial incident, Turkey and Russia in 2015. This would not be the first time NATO or its members faced such a dilemma. On November 24, 2015, a Turkish F-16 fighter jet shot down a Russian Su-24 bomber near the Syrian border. According to Turkey, the Russian aircraft had violated Turkish airspace for only 17 seconds, but Ankara insisted that repeated warnings were ignored. The Su-24 was struck by a missile, its pilot ejected, and was tragically killed by rebels on the ground. Russia's reaction was immediate and furious. President Vladimir Putin declared that there would be consequences. The world braced for escalation, yet no war followed. Instead, Russia retaliated through diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and increased military maneuvers in Syria and the Black Sea. The episode highlighted both the fragility of these aerial encounters and the determination of both NATO and Russia to prevent escalation spiraling into full-scale war. Now imagine such a confrontation taking place in 2025, not on the Syrian border, but deep inside NATO's own territory in Poland or Lithuania. With Russia still engaged in its conflict in Ukraine and NATO's eastern members on edge, the consequences could be far more severe. The escalation spiral in 2025. If the RAF had been ordered to fire and the IL-20 had been destroyed over Polish territory, the chain of events would likely have been rapid and dramatic. Moscow's initial response would have been outrage, both diplomatic and military. Russian officials would summon NATO ambassadors, accuse the alliance of aggression, and flood domestic and international media with accusations of hostility. On the ground, Russia would likely reinforce its military posture. Air patrols over Kaliningrad would intensify, and short-range Iskander missile systems might be deployed or activated within striking distance of Warsaw and other NATO capitals. The message would be clear: Russia would not allow such actions to go unanswered. Within 48 hours, NATO would almost certainly respond by reinforcing its eastern flank. The Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, a rapid deployment brigade numbering several thousand troops, could be rushed to Poland and the Baltic states. American Patriot missile defense systems might arrive in Poland, and naval patrols across the Baltic Sea would increase. The alliance would present a united front, signaling to Moscow that aggression would only strengthen NATO's cohesion rather than weaken it. At the same time, NATO would seek to keep escalation under control. Deconfliction hotlines between Brussels and Moscow, established precisely to prevent incidents from spiraling into catastrophe, would light up. Messages would be carefully crafted. The downing of the IL-20 was not an act of aggression but a defensive measure after repeated warnings. The communication would be blunt yet measured, aimed at drawing a line without pushing both sides over the brink. Political and economic consequences. The first real impacts of such a shootdown would be political and economic rather than military. Politically, the alliance itself would feel the strain. Eastern European states such as Poland, Lithuania, and Estonia would demand an even stronger response, insisting on more troops, more missile defense systems, and a tougher stance against Russia. Western European countries, particularly Germany, France, and Italy, might counsel restraint, wary of uncontrolled escalation and economic retaliation. The United States would also find itself under pressure. With elections looming and NATO's credibility under scrutiny, Washington would be forced to reassure allies of its commitment to collective defense while also managing domestic political divisions. Isolationist voices might question NATO's relevance or argue against further entanglement, while others would insist that failure to act decisively would undermine the alliance's credibility permanently. The economic consequences would be immediate. Global markets react instantly to military incidents, and the downing of a Russian aircraft by NATO would send shockwaves. Oil and gas prices would spike overnight, given Europe's dependence on energy imports and Russia's ability to disrupt supply routes. Airline stocks would plummet as routes over Eastern Europe were rerouted, raising costs and delays. Defense industry shares, on the other hand, would surge. Eastern European economies would prepare for cyber attacks or energy disruptions, while governments across the continent would brace for broader instability. Public anxiety would surge as well. In Poland and the Baltic states, civil defense drills might be reinstated. Governments would issue calm reassurances, but citizens would live under the shadow of escalation. The sense of vulnerability would be difficult to suppress. The nuclear dimension. The gravest risk lies in the nuclear shadow such an incident would cast. Russia integrates nuclear weapons into its doctrine not only as a last resort, but as tools of intimidation, what analysts call escalate to de-escalate. A NATO shootdown of a Russian reconnaissance plane could prompt Moscow to heighten nuclear signaling through missile relocations, bomber movements, or declarations of readiness. NATO would avoid rhetorical brinkmanship but quietly reposition assets, adjust defenses, and emphasize readiness in exercises. The danger is less an immediate exchange than a misread signal, where one drill or unexpected missile shift could trigger escalation far beyond intent. NATO's unity on trial. A crisis would test NATO's cohesion as Eastern members demand permanent deployments and a tougher stance, while Western states stress diplomacy and stability. The alliance would have to balance these priorities without exposing fractures. For Washington, the challenge is sharper. U.S. leadership is vital to NATO unity, yet domestic politics often cast doubt on its commitment. In such a moment, the United States would be pressed to reaffirm its role while navigating debates between isolationists and internationalists at home. Gray zone warfare. Even without open conflict, a crisis would almost certainly ignite the gray zone. Cyber attacks, disinformation, and covert operations. Russia has long used these tools, and a NATO shootdown would justify retaliation. Likely targets include European banks, energy grids, and communications. Disinformation would flood social media to fracture NATO unity and erode public trust. NATO's response would center on stronger cyber defenses, sharper information campaigns, and increased support for Ukraine. The aftermath. Even if the crisis de-escalated quickly, its effects would linger for years. NATO would harden its air defenses with stricter no-fly zones, more patrols, and faster engagement protocols. Russia would lean further on gray zone tactics, escalating cyber and disinformation campaigns. Most troubling, diplomacy would shrink. Leaders on both sides would face pressure to act faster, leaving less room for judgment or restraint. making future miscalculations ever more likely. If this deep dive helped you see the stakes behind a single radar blip, hit like and subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss our next mission level breakdown. I want to hear your take. If a NATO-Russia air incident happened tomorrow, what's the first domino to fall? Political, military, or economic? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone and pin the most insightful. Stay sharp, stay curious, and as always, see you in the next mission.